in some sense, in talking to young people, I hear a lot about wanting to get offline. There's this impulse to be in the real world, but then like AI is happening. And I don't know how that's going to play out. I don't know if we're going to have kind of a wake up moment as a society.
Well, hello out there in podcast land. Welcome to a new edition of the Liberal Patriot podcast. I'm your host, Ruy Teixeira, and I come at you every couple of weeks, as you know, with the very finest and heterodox conversation analysis with the most interesting and stimulating guests. And today I'm pleased as punch, several glasses of punch, to have my AI colleague, Christine Emba, on with us today. Christine is a senior fellow at AEI, and her work focuses on, according to the webpage, and I think this is accurate, gender and sexuality, feminism, masculinity, youth culture, and social norms. That's a lot. She's also a contributing writer at the New York Times, a visiting fellow at the Center for Economy and Society at Johns Hopkins. Now, before joining AEI, maybe some of you encountered her. She was a staff writer at The Atlantic for a while. She was a very considerable period. She was a columnist and editor at The Washington Post. Before that, she was a Hilton Kramer Fellow in Criticism, a New Criterion and deputy editor at Economist Intelligence Unit. And very importantly, she is the author of a fascinating, fairly recent book, 2022 book, Rethinking Sex, a Provocation. So I thought, Christine, we'd start by talking a little bit about your book, which I do recommend to everybody. What's your basic shtick, as it were? and what, if anything, do you think has changed in the zeitgeist since you wrote it? I mean, 2022 isn't that long ago, but things move fast these days.
Things do move fast. Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and hello to all the listeners out there. It's exciting to be on the show.
Terrific.
As for Rethinking Sex, the subtitle of Rethinking Sex, as you put it, was a provocation. And when I wrote the book, I meant that not as, I'm writing this book to make people angry or to provoke conflict, right, but actually to try and sort of provoke people to have conversations that they hadn't felt comfortable having aloud, or to push people towards realizations that they might not have admitted to themselves about sex, about gender, about how our society kind of views this relationship space. So the book, I would say, had maybe two main thrusts. The first was that consent, which we had taken to be sort of like the moral arbiter of sex that was either ethical, legal, good or not, especially post Me Too, was not actually a good enough ethical dividing line. That is to say, consent was not enough to have good sex. It is the baseline. You should always get consent if you're having sex with somebody, but just getting consent doesn't make things good because it doesn't take into account the full humanness of the other person and all of the other factors that are involved in our relationships, and shape how we come into our interactions with others. And so I suggested that instead of just using sort of like, the bars on the floor level of consent, we should push ourselves to think about willing the good of the other instead. So not just did you get permission, but is this thing that I'm doing as good for the other person as it is for me, which is something that
the benefits exceed the costs, so to speak.
Yeah, but not just like a utilitarian view. I also thought, and think that there is a moral and ethical and sort of like telos to sex, to relationships, to our embodied nature. And so that was kind of the second point of the book. There are a number of chapters that sort of try to interrogate concepts that we sort of take for granted in this sexual moment that I wanted to pressure readers to maybe think a little bit more about. So, for example, there's a chapter on privacy that suggests that maybe the concept of privacy that we think we have is not really real, and maybe not all that it's cracked up to be. The idea that men and women are, in fact, different and come to and experience sex differently. And that should be something that we take into account when we're thinking about whether sex is good or ethical or not. The idea that, we can make moral judgments and that some desires are in fact worse than others and possibly morally corrosive or, ethically offensive. And also just the idea that freedom, as we've come to understand it in sort of the sexual landscape, maybe has not been as totally and all-encompassingly awesome for
Right.
everybody involved as we thought that it would be. As I put in the book in one of the earlier chapters, this should theoretically be like a great time for young people, especially to be having sex. There's contraception, sex is on TV, we feel comfortable talking about it, sort of.
Sort
But
of.
instead, like, young people are having less sex than ever.
Right. Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
kind
The
of feels
paradox.
like, we tore down all the rules around sex so as not to hem anyone in. But now everybody feels kind of lost. And so we need to think about how that happened and what to do about it.
Yeah. You mentioned the differences between men and women. That is a chapter in your book. And I wanted to ask you about that because I do think arguably it underlies a lot of these problems. When you look at the changing norms around sexuality and relationships, the sort of libertinism that, so long as you have consent, anything goes, it's all great. This differentially affects men and women. Now, you touch on some of the ways that disadvantages women in your chapter in your book, and they're more or less kind of structural. That has to do with who is going to really bear the costs, who has to actually be responsible to contribute. There's a bunch of things that are just like part of the material reality. But one thing you didn't talk about that I thought I'd ask you about is arguably beyond those macroscopic structural factors, there's an underlying psychological difference between men and women, which is in fact probably hardwired based on their differential reproductive strategies, right? I mean, this is a commonality of evolutionary psychology that given the different interests of men and women in reproducing their genetic structure, as it were, they're gonna have different pre-programming. They're hardwired to be different. And is this part of the root of the misunderstanding that if we let everything go, anything go, then that doesn't benefit men and women equally. In fact, I think there's a very strong argument on net. It hurts women more than men, even though, as you point out, there's problems with men as well. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I think that's very true. And it's something that I'm thinking about a lot more frequently now too, as I think more about kind of the structure of the dating landscape and dating markets and dating apps. I think I'd even put a finer point on what you're saying, who benefits, and suggest that in fact, and who is harmed, that, these like different drives, it seems, like there are often actually some men who might be very successful in finding partners or mates, but actually a large proportion of men who just might not be if it was like sort of in this like open field environment. And so a lot of men get left out too. And then, yeah, also women just sort of will biologically and sometimes emotionally invest more in relationships and, can get hurt. One of the places where I think this is really evident, the more I've thought about it, is or like these differences in sort of reproductive strategy and gender psychology. Although, caveat, not all people feel like this, not all people act like this, etc.
Different distributions.
Yeah. But dating apps, the first successful dating app, like phone-based dating app, was actually Grindr, the app for gay sex. And Grindr was and still is basically like you see cards of people and it tells you sort of like where their location, like where they are if they're available, and you can just like reach out to someone and hook up with them.
Right.
Like that was the point of Grindr. And it seemed really successful for like the male psychology in some sense. Like there were actually a lot of guys apparently who were like, hey, yeah, I just like want to hook up with someone. They're in my area. I'll text them. They'll come over. Cool. That's what relationships look like in sort of this all male landscape.
Right, exactly.
And then, because Grindr was successful, Tinder actually modeled itself off of Grindr, in the same sense of like, okay, you'll see pictures of people with like a little information. You'll know that they're single because they're on Tinder. You message them, you meet up with them. Who knows what happens next?
Mm-hmm.
And, that is not really how women date, actually.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so when you sort of import a dating landscape that's kind of made for the gay male psychology into like heterosexual dating spaces, it doesn't quite work the same way. Or like the women who find themselves in this landscape like may not respond, and in fact do not respond, like the gay men who found themselves on Grindr. As it turns out, most women are unlikely to text you once, meet up with you, and agree to have sex with you. Or if they do, often they would rather not, but they feel like they don't necessarily have those options. And this is made, most dating apps are kind of based on a Tinder-esque model right now. And it's actually just not a model that fits the psychology of heterosexual dating, at least for women.
Yeah, I mean, and this is exactly as theory would predict, right? I mean, that I laid out from evolutionary psychology. I mean, this is, if you thought about it for 5 seconds, if you were thinking about it as opposed to trying to make money off an app, you would realize these would be fundamentally different things given the sort of pre-programming, as it were, of men and women. But nobody, I mean, people seem reluctant to talk about that stuff, which I think is weird in a way because it's so obvious to everybody. So I guess that leads to another question is, in terms of this kind of an issue and the broader issues that you deal with, how much harm is really attributable to this like absurd blank slate model of people? We're all like, everybody's the same, men and women, they're different gender roles, but they're all, they have to do with what toys they're given when they grow up, and it's all culture. And I mean, this is complete bullshit, right? But people still believe this stuff, particularly on the progressive left. That even to talk about how men and women are fundamentally different in their drives and preferences is to give in to the man, give in to the patriarchy. So am I overemphasizing this, or is this as big a problem as I think it is?
I think it's a really big problem. And I think that actually one of the things we're seeing in this particular moment is people becoming more comfortable talking about it, or at least trying to bring up the discussion, whether, it comes to whether trans athletes should participate in women's sports, whether we are beginning to talk about, the demographic crisis and sort of work versus home roles in a sort of kind of worrying sense to me sometimes, when there's this like overemphasis on, trad wives and like alpha male masculinity coming from the right. I think all of this is a reflection of people being like, wait, there's something we need to be, like something is different between men and women, and we need to figure out how to like make that visible in the landscape or like work around that. But, I will say that I have sympathy for the progressive left and the feminist movement in their unwillingness to talk about it.
Okay.
And I brought this up in both the book Rethinking Sex and in a long essay I wrote in the post about masculinity. A summer ago, actually, now. For a long time, for centuries, and this is what the feminist movement was pushing back against, there was a very clear sort of delineation of gender roles, an idea that male and female were separate and different, but specifically that male and female were different and female was worse. Women were less capable than men. They were less strong. We shouldn't let them do anything because they're like kind of dumb and ungovernable, or, various other stereotypes about how femaleness was worth less than maleness. And so I think, sexual revolution, sort of messaging wise, the feminist movement messaging wise, spent a lot of time trying to make the case and succeeding in making the case that actually women are of equal worth to men. Women are not worse than men. Women are not stupider than men. And so women should be given the same rights that men have. and given the same respect that men have, because women can do things that men can do. Women are also capable. And I think along the way, that messaging got a little bit messed up, a little bit whiffed. And, this has to do with kind of like the girl boss sort of lean in movement,
Right.
sort of like capitalist takeover of the feminist movement that said like, yeah, men and women are the same. And that's why women should work a ton, just like men should. That's why
80
women
hours
should
a
lean into
week.
their
That's how you
careers.
succeed.
Yeah, and not have children and, not pay attention to their biology because women can do what men can do, right? And I think a lot of progressives and feminists sort of resist talking about how women are different from men or men are different from women, because there's this underlying fear that if you bring up the subject of difference, everyone will revert back to this idea of like different means worse, like separate but equal doesn't really work. And different but equal seems to not necessarily work in our gender discourse. And so there's this fear that if you're like, well, women are like this and men are like that, that first women will be like trapped into sort of these stereotypes of gender and femininity that they had been for centuries. And that those things will once again be coded as bad. So it's kind of better to just pretend they don't exist and pretend that everyone is equal. And that's the way you'll achieve equality. Like I'm sympathetic to not wanting to risk the gains of the feminist movement, progressive gains. But we're seeing cracks in that solution because, it's not true. Men and women are not the same. And we can't pretend that they're the same forever because the truth will out.
Yeah, how plausible is it anyway that, I get the logic behind it and the fears behind it, but how plausible is it at this point in historical time in a country like the United States that if you start talking about some underlying differences between men and women, there would be this massive, backlash that would put women back in being housewives and not being able to compete for certain jobs. It's a consensual view in American society that discrimination is bad, whether it be by race or by gender. And I think that, women are outcompeting men in terms of educational attainment. It's happening, right? So it just seems like overwrought at this point to worry about trying to have untrammeled discourse about the differences between men and women and somehow that bleeding into, a complete reversal of the gains of the last 75 years, which are historic. One thing I think people have a hard time wrapping their minds around is how incredibly much progress there's been in a relatively short period of historical time. I think we're on the train, and I think the idea we're going to push women off the train is a bit overwrought at this point. Or maybe I'm just too optimistic.
I think you're pretty optimistic, actually. I also want to echo, the gains have been incredible. And, it makes sense to want to preserve those gains. Like within my lifetime, women were not allowed to have credit cards, right? Only in the last 10 years was marital rape outlawed in all 50 states. Like women were in several states still considered to be enough property of their husband that marital rape was like not considered rape on the books. But at the same time, like if you look at the discourse happening right now, I mentioned sort of like this trad wife discourse coming from the right. You're seeing right-wing influencers make this case that, like women are different. They're softer, like they should be having children and caring for the home. And that's why women don't need to go to college. Don't go to college was the explicit messaging from the latest Charlie Kirk conference.
Yeah, but I fearlessly predict this will have no effect whatsoever. I'm going to go on record here. It's not going to happen.
I hope so, but I feel like I'm seeing some of this discourse kind of leak out into how younger women especially are thinking about and making choices for their future. There's this push like, women, they're like hormonal cycles are just like such a big problem for them. Like women, you should make sure that you only find work that like aligns with your feminine energy. So don't try and become a doctor, don't become an engineer. And, young women are susceptible to some of these messages. And it might not be that
Right.
they choose to, not exist in the world, but it might be like, oh, wow, maybe my worth does depend more than I thought on my youth or appearance. And so I should just marry this person,
Yeah, yeah, that's bad.
or like
That's bad.
maybe I don't
I'll go ahead
need
and record.
to.
That's bad. Um,
Yeah.
well, what about the paradox of gender equality, though, right? I mean, we know from the studies that the most gender equal societies in the world, like the Nordic countries, there's actually more differentiation by gender in terms of choice of occupation than in some other less advanced societies. So, that's obviously not a product in those countries of there being a lot of right-wing influencers telling people not to become scientists. I mean, there's something else going on there. So have you looked into that, thought about that?
Yeah, no, and I've seen those statistics, and it's it's interesting and I think confounding for the left often when they try to make an example of like, oh, these Scandinavian countries have, you know, maternity leave and state provided daycare. So why aren't they having more children? Like why, why
Right.
aren't
Oh, yeah. What's
all
going
these
on?
causes taking place? Um, I think that they're especially I think in sort of these left paradises, these European countries where there is great social support and a social safety net for everybody in society. I think that both women and men feel more freedom in making choices that like might align with their desires, frankly.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that that's a good thing, actually, knowing that like you can make a choice that aligns with the way that you want to live your life, whether it's working less, whether it's having more or fewer kids, and you that's a safer thing to do. Like I think it is safer for a woman to make the choice to work part-time for several years with her children, knowing that if she and her husband separate, she will still have social security or a safety net. She won't be left in penury because she didn't stock up the hours, which is often what happens in the US to women who separate from their partners after taking leave of their career to stay with their kids. I think that those policies are great because they allow people to make freer choices. But they don't necessarily have the effect of making women and men the same. They just actually allow women and men to make choices aligned with their true desires and feel safe doing so. And I think that's actually okay.
That's a good thing. Yeah, yeah. Well, let's talk about the youth. I love talking about
Yeah.
America's youth. I love our coming generations. They're the future and all that jazz. So you mentioned you think like some of these younger parts of the younger generation, they're getting influenced sort of in almost in this trad wife direction. They're becoming more conservative. I mean, what's your assessment? Do you think Gen Z, for example, really is a lot different than the millennials? And if so, what explains that? How much of it is a cultural reaction? How much of it is just a zeitgeist? Are they really looking at sex and relationships different than you, a millennial, did?
Yeah. So I am definitely a millennial. I am like center of the millennial cohort. And I look upon Gen Z with sort of fascination and concern
Mm-hmm.
in a lot of ways. I think when I think about the differences between the two generations, between millennials and Gen Z, I think there are maybe two main things that come to mind for me. First, millennials did not grow up with the internet in their pockets.
Right.
I had like we had dial-up AOL in my house when I was growing up, but I didn't get a smartphone until I left college. I was not like on social media as a teenager. I still had kind of a pretty analog childhood and a comparatively analog growing up. Like um, Facebook was founded in, I want to say '06.
Sounds
Like
right.
yeah, I got a Facebook account when I went to college, and you still had to have like a .edu address to get on
Yeah,
Facebook.
right, right. Oh, that's
Um,
old school, man. Old school.
yeah. So it was still kind of a closed garden. It didn't have the algorithms really, um, and I think I was lucky, frankly,
Mm.
to have grown up not under that influence. Whereas Gen Z is really a generation that, just like they were on smartphones, tablets, screens, the internet from day one. Many of them really came of age with those tools, and even with those tools sort of supercharged as part of their life because of COVID. My younger sister, who's 25, spent 2 years of her college experience on Zoom.
Yeah, we'll leave that aside, but that was just ridiculous.
Yeah, no, it
People
definitely
should
was.
be
And it
ashamed that they made
also,
people go through that. But anyway.
yeah, and especially like even younger kids who should have been in school, like learning to socialize, learning to interact with each other.
Tragic mistake.
Yeah, and I think we're really beginning to see what that means as this generation matures and we see how dependent they are, how shaped they are by digital lives and digital tools. So that's like one difference. The second difference for millennials is that, okay, we did undergo, an economic recession in 2008, but most millennials came of age in a pretty optimistic political climate. Barack Obama was elected. We were all like, yay, harmony, hope and change. Clinton was fine. Bush existed. Politics was not necessarily a major part of our lives. And when it was mostly because like pretty cool stuff seemed to be happening. The arc of history seemed to be like bending towards justice, etc. So it was sort of like a hopeful outlook on what government was like, what politics could do. We watched The West Wing, where everyone's always solving problems and being smart.
No problem. Smart people solving problems. What could go wrong?
Great. Yeah. And Gen Z has had Trump. Chaotic, sort of depressing in a lot of cases.
Yeah, you can't talk about a president that way.
I definitely can't. I mean,
he's the commander-in-chief. No, it's hard. I mean, it is. We grew up in different times. I mean, me especially, but you too. And it's like, what if we had grown up and that was like the reality? That was just like normal. What passed for normal politics. I mean, I think that really would have a big effect.
Yeah, I think it's the past, 2 and gosh, it's only been like half of a year since Trump was elected for a second time, and it feels like much
seems
longer.
Like half a century.
Yeah, but like if your formative political experience is of just like total chaos, mismanagement, fear, and like amorality, then you have a very different view of like how the world works and what you can expect from adults, from your country, from your economy. And I've noticed, and I'm like kind of sort of researching more and talking to people more about this sense of kind of malaise and almost nihilism that I see in a lot of Gen Z, where they're like, nothing works, everyone sucks, like our country's falling apart, I don't trust anyone. How could I? And that feels very different to me and worrying.
Right. Yeah, I mean, if you look at the data from 2024, I mean, there really is a sharp turn to the right among Gen Z, also in millennials to some extent, but especially Gen Z. And there's other data that indicate Gen Z are just flat out more conservative than millennials in a variety of different measures. But you seem to be saying that that's probably not real. What it really is about is they're just rejecting the whole system. They're nihilistic. They think everything's completely screwed up. And it's not so much conservatism in any real way or liberalism, but just, a lack of faith in the system.
Yeah. I mean, so I would say that, Gen Z had the first Trump administration, also like the Me Too movement, also had the Black Lives Matter protests and sort of this like realization, also just like a totally kind of over the top period of sort of like wokeness and identity focus that has sort of shaped their political and social coming up, their growth. And it's confusing and in some cases super alarmist. And so actually, I think what we are seeing in polling from younger people and what we saw in the election is that Gen Z women have become actually much more liberal, or compared to sort of like the millennial baseline.
Yeah,
Like
well, in
Gen
terms of
Z.
the ideological identification, that's true. In terms of their voting behavior, that isn't true. I mean, they did move substantially to the right in 2024. People who
Yeah,
voted at any rate.
I mean, I think that Gen Z women are much more sort of vocal about their identities as women, and
Uh
sort of
huh.
like their fear of sort of these um, causes that progressives have spoken to women about a lot: the patriarchy, climate change, their
Mm-hmm.
abortion rights being taken away, that sort of thing. And Gen Z men, um, I think, have this sort of like nihilism, nothing is working, especially
Mm-hmm.
not for me because I'm a man and we've spent several years saying that men are bad. And so, as
Mm-hmm.
a reaction, tend to be either moving to the right or seem much more right leaning than their female counterparts. And then also, I think for Gen Z men, and this goes back to kind of the gender question that we were talking
Right.
about before, um, there's been a lot of kind of deconstruction of gender identity, what it means to be male and female in the past decade. Uh, and I think a lot of young men honestly feel kind of lost and confused. And the conservative movement promotes this idea of like, we know what a man is, we love and respect men. Trump is a man, a strong
Mm-hmm.
man at that.
Right.
And that's really attractive to young men who don't feel like they necessarily have like respect or role models elsewhere. And I think that can pull a lot of people to conservatism too.
Yeah. Well, do you feel like, in a sense, the feminist wing of the Democratic Party and just the feminist movement in general, um, by essentially promoting the kind of concept of toxic masculinity, has helped move some of those men in that conservative direction? Because if men grow up feeling like being a man is basically sort of that's two strikes against you in the moral department, that's, as I pointed out, women are out competing men in educational attainment and other things at this point. So they do feel a bit lost. Have feminists kind of whiffed on that? And again, this almost gets back to not understanding or acknowledging the differences between men and women. I mean, men are different from women, but that doesn't mean all those differences are bad. I mean,
Yeah.
they are. They're part of our underlying programming, and we all have to figure out how to deal with it.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. I think that they have whiffed or maybe over indexed
Yeah.
on
Okay.
a certain level of kind of male bashing and women female promoting to the extent that they have made men feel like they don't belong, or that they are an oppressed class in their own way, that they don't aren't understood and don't matter, and that is like a very radicalizing emotion.
Yes.
I mean, I know
Mm-hmm.
that you've worked on this. You could like talk more about how that process works, but I think that's exactly what's happened to a lot of men.
Well, how do you think our norms are changing at the current time in terms of all this? Or what is the direction of change that you see as we move into, through the first year of the Trump administration and just sort of the point of historical time we're at? Are we going to move more in a traditionalist direction? Are we going to come to some sort of settlement that'll be a compromise between more traditionalist and more libertine approach? I mean, is Gen Z going to demand that we, in a sense, and maybe part of the millennial generation, let's cut the bullshit and let's deal with the fact we're humans, men are different from women, and we want to be happy and we want to have good relationships, and we've got to stop being so ideological about this stuff.
I mean, I would love to see it.
Do you see it?
I'm not. You know, it's kind of hard to figure out where we're moving norms wise, just
Mm-hmm.
because it really hasn't been that long since the election, since the inauguration, but also because I think there are just a lot of confounding factors, and it's hard to predict how some of them are going to play out.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I do see, a trend towards kind of more gender differentiation
Hmm.
when it comes to sort of like self-presentation on in some quarters, and then a trend for less at the same time. So, just like a huge number of um, Gen Z now identify as somewhere on the LGBTQ spectrum.
Yeah, the most of
Like,
those are bisexual, and it's not clear how meaningful
yeah,
a lot of
but
those
I think it's like one
identifications
in
are.
1 in 4, 1 in 5 members of Gen Z,
Hmm.
um, which is a lot and suggests perhaps some level of like, if not gender confusion, a sort of fluidness in gender
Hmm.
that
Sure. Hmm.
feels new. Um, but yeah, but at the same time, you have like the manosphere, these podcasters and other sort of content creators making content, for men, to teach men how to be, that often encourage sort of separateness from women and like
Right.
weird ways of making money, is that's still really popular.
Yeah, isn't it
And
true that in terms of the content that people of that age now consume, it's heavily telescoped? I mean, there's a sort of a male group
yeah,
of sites or YouTube influencers or TikTok, and then there's like the women, and it's very different, right? I
right.
mean,
They're like, they live in kind of separate universes.
hmm.
And if that continues, it's going to be harder to imagine the sexes like reconciling in a healthy
Right.
way, because you have to sort of understand the other side to have a relationship with them. And to that point, we're seeing sort of huge drop offs in dating, relationships, marriage, etc. in Gen Z. Um, I think that one of the things that's going to continue to sort of confound predictions is like what technology looks like.
Hmm.
So, in some sense, in talking to young people, I hear a lot about wanting to get offline, being sort of acutely aware that
Right.
social media has sort of ruined their lives, that dating apps are unhealthy and are not helping them find relationships, but they don't
Hmm.
know how. They're like, oh, like I wish I could meet someone.
Yeah. What is this real life stuff people keep
Yeah,
talking
like
about?
do I just like go stand
Uh-huh.
in a bar? Like how do we what's a date?
Right.
um And so that there's this impulse to be in the real world, but then like AI is happening, right? And suddenly like
Mm.
the algorithms have gotten even better. Like instead of, putting on a shirt and like having to do all this stuff and like put forth effort to get a girlfriend, like why not watch incredibly realistic pornography? Why not
Well, that's not
gamble
too
with your
optimistic.
friends on a sports betting app instead of like
Right.
going to an event? Um, and I don't know how that's going to play out. I don't know how good AI is going to get. I don't know if we're going to have kind of a wake up moment as a society. We didn't have that with social media. You could have stopped and been like, hey, is this good for us? Is this making our lives better? Like, is this helpful? If not, maybe we should slow down. We didn't, and we ended up where we ended
And
up. And
here
now
we
we're doing the
are.
same thing with AI.
Hmm.
So like it's hard for me to sort of understand like how that will shape norms going forward. Um, Other trends, like our economy is also very confusing right now. I think in part because of AI, in part because of sort of this tariff business, in part because of just trends like a glut of people graduating from college. The job
Hmm.
market is really tough for Gen Z right now. Um, and I can see that leading to more of that kind of economic nihilism, malaise, or sort of just a more conservative outlook on like getting a steady job and like finding something steady in your life to hold on to, that could be marriage, a family, like religiosity. Um, I'm not sure where that's going to turn. And we do see more of the younger generation becoming interested in religion also.
Yes. No, that's a very interesting trend.
Yeah, perhaps as a response to the sort of uncertainty and confusion that seems endemic to the rest of the world right now. That is one of my theories, anyways.
Right.
Uh, Religion, with its sort of like clear roles, clear gender expectations in many cases, um, clarity of purpose, is really attractive. And this sort of like idea of enchantment, or that there is something meaningful at the end of the day, is like could be seen as a real lifeline for young people in this moment. So I can see that trend. continuing to pick up steam.
Yeah, it certainly seems like a reasonable alternative at this point to the dating scene, which you described by someone you quote as terrifying and chaotic. And we see actually a trend away from using the apps, or in some sort of decline at this point. But I guess what you're raising is, where does all that go? I mean,
Yeah.
ideally, it should go into meeting people in real life and having good relationships and sex and all that sort of stuff. But maybe it's going to lead into even weirder technological things, AI girlfriends, blah, blah, blah. As the tech gets better, or maybe people just, instead of, maybe they're less online in terms of dating, and maybe they just don't date at all, period. So
Yeah.
that's a little terrifying. And religion would be an alternative to that. It gives you at least a clear direction to move yourself in, and maybe a set of some slots and norms that you can fit into that are sort of preset, as it were. In a sense, it is hard to suss out exactly how. We know we're in a period of flux. We know that people are very dissatisfied with the current dating scene, but what that's going to produce is anyone's guess at this point, I think.
Yeah. What
true.
trends do you see, or what can you imagine shifting in the future from your perspective?
Yeah, well, I agree. It is hard to suss out. I mean, I do think that the trend of dissatisfaction is real. I think people do have a preference over the medium term for some sort of lifetime stability. Many people are interested in having children. People are interested in stable family lives. We know that married people are happier than single people. And I think the move toward acknowledging that is a correct point of view, and that you should be able to do that if you want to, and that there are aspects of the way our culture works now, including things like the apps, that are not conducive to that. And it's actually fine to want to have a more traditional life, at least in that sense. And that's a good thing to aspire to, even if it's a little harder to come by in real life. So I think that trend there'll continue to be oomph behind that. I think people are becoming disenchanted with the anything goes, various types of cultures that are attached to that. And they're not deriving as much satisfaction from it, either short-term or long-term, as they would like. So I think naturally that'll leave people looking for options. But it's very difficult for me to see at this point how it's going to work out. But I do see culture in general moving in a little bit more traditional, in a broadly defined sense, I think, just because the alternative is kind of unsatisfactory. So I think it's not exactly everybody's going to become a trad wife and everybody's going to live in a farm and, raise hogs or something and, have a mess of children. But I do think that people realize it wasn't actually a crazy idea to have a two-parent family with some kids and have a stable life. That's actually, that's pretty good, not bad at all. So
makes people happy.
Yeah.
But I mean, so that's at the cultural prediction. What are you thinking about politically for younger generations? I know you're a more sophisticated thinker there too. Where do you see this going?
Well, I don't know about that. I think the dissatisfaction with both sides is pretty serious at this point, particularly among younger voters. I mean, Yuval Levin, our colleague at AEI, and me wrote a report came out before the 2024 election called Politics Without Winners, where we basically argue that neither party seems to have articulated an alternative and approach that really build a broad majority coalition that would rope in increasing sectors of the electorate, including among younger voters. And I don't see anything that changes my mind at this point. I mean, I think there are definitely aspects to the current GOP that have moved in a direction that does rope in more working class voters, and we saw more young voters vote for them in the last election. But it's still very off-putting to a lot of voters. It's not clear they're building a majority. They're just sort of going to use the power they have to do what they want, and then they'll get tossed out by the Dems, and they'll take over again. But I think the Democrats, which actually, and I've written a lot about this, have an opportunity to sort of reinvent their party so that it is more attractive to broader sectors of the electorate, discard some of the crazier cultural stuff they were associated with, and become, America's common sense normie party. But I just don't see that happening yet. I think it could happen, and I think young people would be interested, young voters would be interested in something that seemed non-crazy.
I have two follow-ups for you there, actually. Well,
Mm-hmm.
two things that I have been like kind of mildly thinking about. And I'd love to get your read. And this is also, I guess, related to young people. One of the things that I have talked about in my writing on masculinity, but actually seems like it applies very broadly to the Democratic Party, to sort of our political culture in general, is that a lot of the issue seems to be that no one is providing a positive vision.
Mm-hmm.
For men in sort of like the masculinity question, like a lot of men maybe feel lost or feel confused. The world is changing, and there's no one really providing a positive vision of like, this is what a man could be.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually a good thing. Here are like some steps you can take. The feminist movement, progressive movement have often been like, men are toxic.
Mm-hmm.
This is what bad men look like. Don't be like that. Don't be like yourself. Also, good luck. Like,
Right.
just be good.
Mm-hmm.
And like the only person offering sort of like a positive vision in that space is often sort of these manosphere and right wing figures. And that
Yeah, I
positive
think
vision
that's broadly correct.
is sometimes not that positive. But I think the positive vision, the lack thereof, is a problem politically too. Like, as you say, the Democrats have gotten very good at being like Trump, orange, evil, monster, fascist. Don't vote for him. But then it's like, what are you doing? Like, why would I vote for you? And it's like not
Right.
very clear.
Mm-hmm.
The two images of a potential positive vision that I am seeing circulating right now are the abundance movement, which I'm not totally convinced by, and I'm not sure that I see it getting that
Right.
much
Yeah, you
traction
wrote
in the
about
real
that on
world.
your Substack. That was
Yeah,
interesting.
and then the contrasting vision is Zoran Mamdani, the Democratic Socialist who
Right.
seems poised to succeed in New York City, who does provide a very positive vision of like what his quasi-socialist New York could look like, and actually got a lot of support and youth support from around the country. Like, what do those say to you? What do you think either of those kind of visions is plausible for the Democratic Party or the left generally? Or is there some third option?
Well, this is definitely leading us astray from
I know, sorry, I took us off
warp
topic.
and woof of our previous conversation. But my view on the abundance thing, certainly, I mean, you mentioned it in sort of your intro to that, was talking about about young men and they're feeling unmoored from where progressives have been coming from. Certainly abundance, almost by definition, can do nothing about that. I mean, there's no such thing as abundance masculinity. It's basically a pretty technocratic point of view about how we should deregulate our ability to get things done in this country and do more stuff. And if we did more stuff, we'd have more clean energy, we'd have better infrastructure, we'd have better governed cities, all that jazz, which I think has some truth to it. I'm somewhat sympathetic to it. I think that as a program, even as economic policy, it has some things that it's lacking. And it certainly has zero to say about cultural issues, which I think is key to a lot of men at this point, and our culture and politics in general. I mean, cultural politics is a huge part of politics in general. And as for Zoran Mamdani, I think his stuff plays well in New York City. I mean, in the Commie Corridor, and that stretches from Astoria down to Sunset Park. But it's not clear to me at all that this would be particularly popular among the masses of honest workers and peasants in America, particularly young men. So I think the thing about Mamdani that's kind of interesting, he was just sort of anti-establishment. You know, the establishment is fundamentally corrupt. We need to do something completely different. And I think that is attractive to a lot of people, not just like, affluent, precariat professionals in Brooklyn, Queens. But I don't think there's a big lesson there for Democrats or progressives in terms of how to more broadly appeal. And certainly, I think this doesn't tell us much about how Democrats can start figuring out a better pitch and a better approach to dealing with male voters, how they get away from being the party that's associated with the toxic masculinity view of American males. I think that in and of itself, that's toxic masculinity is toxic. And I think they need to figure out how to do and say things that are quite different. I don't think either one of those holds the key to that particular lock.
Yeah, does it have to be a cultural message to win? I mean, I think like the economic questions are also kind of part of it, right? Like in a changing economy and an economy
Oh,
where
absolutely.
manufacturing
Absolutely.
continued to move, that's affecting men too. But it almost seems like people are more responsive right now to the cultural signaling of like, we're on your side, we're
Right.
listening to your problems at least,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
something like that, no matter what the underlying policy is, especially for young people in a sense.
Yeah, I don't think there's any way of getting away from cultural politics. To some extent, cultural politics filters what people are willing to listen to in terms of policy that has to do with economics, policy
Mm.
that has to do with budgets, policy that has to do with how you govern. People want to know, are you on my side or aren't you? Do you share my values or don't? Are you a crazy person or are you not? Do you think I'm an idiot or don't you? Right? So all these things are heavily freighted with cultural values, concerns, debates. And I think unless you're able to portray yourself as a candidate or party or whatever as someone who is fundamentally sympathetic to the people you're talking to and don't look down on them and aren't associated with a lot of cultural tropes they find appalling, then I think that your ability to communicate about your economic and other ideas is going to be severely restricted. So that's why I think politics in general has to be always be about both culture and economic sort of issues as well. They can't be separated as much as I think a lot of people would like to. And that's, Republicans realize this better than Democrats at this point. And that
Yeah.
is part of the reason they've had some advantages. So I don't want to give away all my trade secrets here, Christine, about American politics. So, but I do think I do instruct people to review what Christine has said and what we've talked about here about culture, men, women, the dating scene, the crazy topsy-turvy world that Gen Z and millennials have to navigate, because I think it's really important. And I think Christine's writings always provide a really good window on that. And I do recommend her book, which is easily available on Amazon, cheap Kindle edition available, I understand. So I commend that to you, and keep an eye out for writing in the Times and all that. So with that, Christine, I think we'll wind it up. But I want to thank you for being on the Liberal Patriot podcast. And I always offer
Of course.
to buy my guests lunch at AEI. And that's going to be so easy for you. You're over at 11 DuPont. Come on by.
I will
and
come right over.
We'll break bread.
Thanks so much for having me.
Hey, thanks for being on.